Hey everybody, Eric Hayden here in the garden. Wanted to do an update today on the weeds in our garden. We put down a pre-emergent, if you watched our videos back in February, I think it was mid to late February, and again in the latter part of March. And we've had pretty good results so far. We've had a ton of rain, a ton of warm, humid weather the past week or two. So you really would expect to see some weeds popping up in the garden. And in my lawn, for the most part, I haven't had weeds. We pay for a service to come treat it, but the bare areas where they don't treat it, I do have crabgrass. So I know that weeds are growing, but so far so good, not so much in my rose beds or the flower gardens. So I'll give you an update on that in a second. Before I get to it, you might kind of get a chuckle when I have this hat on. I don't know if you can tell, but this is a long sleeve shirt that I wear. I do this by design. Our sun is very, very strong here in eastern North Carolina. Not only is it a higher sun angle than we had up in upstate New York, we usually have an abundance of sun. We're 3 miles from the ocean, so we often get a sea breeze. And what that does right here by the coast is it clears the clouds out. So we can have anywhere between 80 to 90% full sunshine on any given summer day. So I'm big into sun protection. Yesterday I just had some lunch with some coworkers. I was outside for 45 minutes. I'm not wearing a hat like this, and I didn't think much of it. In fact, after the lunch it got cloudy pretty quickly. Later that night I noticed my nose and forehead were red. Didn't have sunscreen on, didn't have protection. So I can't stress this enough. I'm in the garden every day, sometimes an hour or more. I enjoy it, I like it. I always have my hat on, and these long sleeve shirts my parents have sent down. These are something that you'd find for going to the beach. A lot of times people wear these at the beach, so they're breathable. They don't, it looks like I might be hot, but they're very breathable and they wick moisture away. So not something like a long sleeve cotton shirt. Just want to mention that I do this by design. So as far as the weeds go, if you followed our videos before, when I mention a pre-emergent, it is to prevent most weeds from germinating, and it has done that. If you look at my beds, I don't have a ton of weeds. You will notice some nutsedge. That's this darn grassy weed, and this is the dickens to get rid of. On the snapshot label, this pre-emergent is not rated for nutsedge, so that's why I have that weed and that weed only. To give you an idea how tough this is, I have squirted this with Roundup, some of this, throughout the growing season, and it'll knock it back a little bit, but unless you hit it with 2 to 3 applications of Roundup, again, something that's not selective, you can't kill it. So I've had better luck waiting for the rain, and when it's rainy out, I'll just go ahead and do a little hand weeding. But for the most part, if you look at the beds outside of the nutsedge, look at the absence of weeds. I should have done a before and after, because pretty much each spring I have a tremendous amount of weeds. Here's an example of the nutsedge that has been hit with Roundup. You can see it's dying, but not completely dead, because there's still a lot of green down there. So that's pretty tough to get rid of. Outside of that, not a lot. Here's a couple little weeds trying to pop up there. But again, a pre-emergent is going to prevent most from germinating. And all you have to do with this is just one hand tug, and boom, that area is clear. So it's really cutting down on the amount of hand weeding you're going to have to do. A couple of the exceptions, as I mentioned, if it's not rated for things like nutsedge or different weeds you have, you're still going to have some issues. And then around the plants themselves, especially where my drip irrigation hits, I do have some weeds, and I don't want to have any Roundup down near the base of the plant. So in those circumstances, I'll just hand weed just a little bit. But all in all, things are looking pretty good in the garden. Again, I wish I had an example from the past years of how weedy these gardens would get. And about the hand weeding, I did a bad example of not getting this while it's young. So you notice that these are getting kind of big, this nutsedge over by Hot Princess. So the earlier you see them and you yank them up, the more likely you are to have success in terms of staying on top of the weeds. And eventually, year after year, if you get rid of this nutsedge by hand pulling, it should eventually go away. At least that's my hope. So that video update hopefully showed you that a pre-emergent is definitely worth something considering. Pretty much the only weed I have in the garden right now, again, is that nutsedge, and I'll just do a little hand pulling to get rid of that. The other project we're working on, I showed you this fire pit the other day, or one of our last videos. We've got some chairs and they're looking good, putting down some perennials. And I mentioned that we have 100% sand. I mean, it's a little gray here because they added some topsoil a little bit, but this is sandy as it gets in terms of soil. So I'm going to need to amend that. I'm not as concerned as I am with my rose beds of making the best soil I can, but I can't say enough about composting. I showed you before, our compost pile is not the most beautiful pile. What I mean by that, we don't turn it. I don't put water on it. I just throw my clippings, vegetation from the garden, that's cabbage, you can see some eggshells, and just let it sit. Eventually, this is what you get. So you can see toward the bottom it's sandy because that's the natural soil there. But here, once you get below the grass itself, you're getting dirt that's pretty dark and organic. So that's very, very nice. And when I've dug into this compost pile, I have gotten a lot of worms as well. One thing you do have to be careful of, you can see a little weed seed there and a couple weeds popping up. Since I don't turn it, my pile doesn't get up to the appropriate temperature to kill those weed seeds. I'm not overly concerned. I do not put nutsedge. Whenever I pull up my vegetation, whether it's grass clippings or weeds, I really don't put anything in here like those nutsedge weeds I showed you. I throw those straight in the trash because I don't want to regenerate those in the garden. The other stuff I'm not too worried about because the pre-emergent itself should take care of that, as we've just showed you in this video. There's our squash and tomatoes. They should be kicking in here. And I did the video the other day on potting up the maidens. This got a little crooked in the wind, but there's our Maverick in a 5 or 4 gallon container. I have not done Cajun Moon yet because when I tried to lift this root ball out, if you remember, it was kind of wet. It started to break apart. So I'm gonna let that dry out a little bit and get more root bound before I transfer that to a 4 gallon container. You'll notice not a lot of roses in the garden. We're past our first flush of blooms, so we've deadheaded. And since we did a video on deadheading, this is what happens. You know, when you cut off your old blooms, you start to see new shoots. So we're seeing a lot of new growth on some of these plants. And this is our next round of roses coming. So this is Hot Princess, really good leaves. You can see the bud eye there. So all this active growth where we did the deadheading earlier. Again, here's where we cut off the old bloom, and there's the new growth right there. You can even see some new canes starting to grow on Veterans Honor and also on the Hot Princess as well. As always, I appreciate you all with your following. I know some Rose Clubs are still doing some virtual meetings. Feel free to share any of those videos, and I'd be welcome to do a presentation for your local society. If you all have Zoom or anything like that, we can certainly make it happen. Hope everybody's having a good weekend, and again, I appreciate the new subscribers on the page.